He lived without touch until 6 women held his hands and cried. The scorching summer of 1879 had reduced the plains of Wyoming Territory to a golden-brown expanse that shimmered under the relentless sun. Caleb Harding rode into the struggling settlement of Pine Creek with nothing but his horse, a weathered saddle, and the haunted look of a man who had seen far more than his 45 years should allow. His arrival stirred little interest among the townsfolk, who had learned long ago that the less they knew about a stranger, the better their chances of avoiding trouble. The town consisted of a single dusty street lined with wooden structures that seemed perpetually on the verge of surrender to the harsh elements. The White Pine Saloon, the general store, a small chapel, the sheriff's office, and a handful of other establishments made up the entirety of Pine Creek's commercial district. Beyond that lay scattered homesteads and ranches, clinging to existence in a land that seemed determined to reject human settlement. Caleb dismounted outside the livery stable, his movements deliberate and precise. His face, partially hidden beneath a beard streaked with gray, revealed little emotion as he handed the reins to the stable boy. "How much for a week?" His voice was rough from disuse, the words emerging like stones dragged across dry ground. The boy, no more than 15, flinched at the sound. "$1.50, sir." Caleb reached into his pocket and produced the exact amount without counting. He dropped the coins into the boy's palm, careful to avoid any contact with the young man's skin. The boy noticed the peculiar manner and stepped back, a reaction Caleb had seen countless times before. "Where can a man find work around here?" Caleb asked, retrieving his saddlebags and rifle. "Mr. Thorpe at the sawmill might be hiring. Or maybe the widow Carson needs help with her ranch. She's been struggling since her husband passed last winter." Caleb nodded his thanks and headed toward the modest boarding house at the edge of town. Mrs. Lily Whitaker, a stern-faced woman in her 50s, greeted him with the cautious civility reserved for strangers. "Room's 50 cents a night. Includes breakfast. Extra for bath water," she said, eyeing him warily. "I'll take it for a week," Caleb replied, laying the money on the counter rather than handing it to her directly. Mrs. Whitaker pushed a registry book toward him. "Sign here." As Caleb took the pen, she noticed his hands, rough and calloused, but marked with unusual scars that wrapped around his wrists like manacles. When he finished signing, she turned the book to read the name. "Well, Mr. Harding, room's upstairs, last door on the left. Breakfast at 6. Don't be late or you'll go hungry." Caleb carried his sparse belongings to the small, clean room. It contained a narrow bed, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, a straight-back chair, and a small window that overlooked the town's main street. He placed his rifle carefully against the wall, set his saddlebags on the chair, and sat on the edge of the bed. For a long moment, he remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on his scarred hands. Then, with a practiced motion, he removed his gloves and placed them on the washstand. His hands trembled slightly as they were exposed to the air. The scars were more prominent now, thick, rope-like marks that told a story he had never shared. Caleb flexed his fingers slowly, as if reacquainting himself with their function. Later that evening, Caleb sat in the corner of the White Pine Saloon, nursing a whiskey. He kept his back to the wall and his gloves firmly in place. The other patrons gave him a wide berth, instinctively recognizing a man who preferred solitude. Sheriff Thomas Miller entered the saloon, his gaze immediately finding the stranger. The lawman was in his early 50s, with a thick mustache and eyes that had seen their share of violence. He approached Caleb's table with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to authority. "Evening," the sheriff said, tipping his hat slightly. "Mind if I join you?" Caleb gestured to the empty chair across from him, his expression unchanged. "Thomas Miller. I'm the sheriff here," he said, sitting down. "Just like to know who's passing through my town." "Caleb Harding. Just looking for work." The sheriff studied him carefully. "What kind of work you do, Mr. Harding?" "Whatever pays. I've worked cattle, broke horses, done some mining, logging." "You running from something?" The question was direct, but not accusatory. Caleb met the sheriff's gaze. "No, not anymore." Something in Caleb's eyes caused the sheriff to nod slowly. "Well, Mr. Harding, Pine Creek's a peaceful place. We aim to keep it that way. Won't have any trouble from me, Sheriff." As Miller stood to leave, he noticed Caleb's gloved hands. "Might want to try the Carson place. Widow's been having trouble keeping hired hands. Place is about 3 miles north of town." The following morning, Caleb rode out to the Carson ranch. The property had seen better days. Fences needed mending, outbuildings required repair, and the cattle looked thin. As he approached the main house, a woman emerged onto the porch, a shotgun held confidently in her hands. "That's far enough," she called out. "State your business." Caleb reined his horse to a stop. "Name's Caleb Harding. Sheriff Miller mentioned you might need help around the place." The woman, Sarah Carson, was in her mid-30s with auburn hair, pulled back in a practical bun. Her face, though marked by grief and hardship, retained a striking beauty. She lowered the shotgun slightly, but remained vigilant. "Can you work cattle?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Mend fences? Repair a barn roof? Break horses?" "All of it." She studied him for a moment. "I can't pay much. Room in the bunkhouse, meals, and $10 a month." "Fair enough." Sarah's gaze hardened. "There's something else. I've got 5 women working this ranch with me. My sister and 4 others who lost their men to the fever last year. If that bothers you, right on now." Caleb's expression remained unchanged. "Doesn't bother me. Some men don't like taking orders from women. Don't much care who gives the orders, as long as they make sense." A hint of a smile touched Sarah's lips. "Well then, Mr. Harding, you can put your horse in the stable and meet me by the barn. We got work to do." As Caleb dismounted, he noticed 5 women watching from various points around the property. Each wore practical clothing, trousers or split skirts, work shirts, and wide-brimmed hats. Their faces showed a mixture of curiosity, wariness, and determination. These were women who had learned to survive in a world that offered little mercy. Little did they know that Caleb Harding, the man who flinched at the slightest human contact, would soon become integral to their survival, and they to his redemption. The first week at the Carson ranch tested Caleb's resolve and strength. Each day began before dawn and ended long after sunset, with endless tasks demanding attention. Fences required mending, cattle needed tending, and the barn roof leaked terribly. Sarah Carson worked alongside him, her determination matching his own. She was a woman of few words, preferring to let actions speak. The other women gradually revealed themselves through their daily routines. Emma, Sarah's younger sister by 5 years, possessed a gentleness that belied her capable nature. She managed the household and tended to a small but thriving vegetable garden. Despite the harshness of their circumstances, Emma found ways to bring beauty into their lives. Fresh wildflowers on the table, carefully mended clothes, and occasional music from an old fiddle in the evenings. Abigail Morgan, a widow with hands as calloused as any man's, handled the cattle with remarkable skill. Her face was weathered by sun and grief, but her eyes remained sharp and observant. She had lost her husband and 10-year-old son to the fever, leaving her with nothing but memories and nightmares. Mary Chan worked the horses. Her father had been Chinese, her mother Irish, and she had faced prejudice all her life. When her husband died in a mining accident, leaving her with no claim to his property, she had found refuge at the Carson Ranch. Her skill with horses was unmatched, her patience endless as she gentled even the most spirited animals. Rebecca Wilson, barely 20, had been married just 6 months when her husband succumbed to the fever. She was still learning to navigate her grief, sometimes breaking into tears while performing her chores. Yet she persisted, determined to build a life from the shattered remains of her dreams. The 6th woman, Josephine Carter, remained an enigma. Her dark skin marked her as different in the predominantly white territory, but her presence at the ranch was accepted without question. She spoke rarely, worked tirelessly, and watched everything with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Rumors suggested she had escaped slavery as a child, though no one knew for certain, and no one dared to ask. Caleb kept his distance from all of them, performing his tasks efficiently, but avoiding conversation or proximity whenever possible. He wore his gloves constantly, removing them only in the privacy of the small room he occupied in the bunkhouse. The women noticed his peculiarities but respected his silence, recognizing in him a familiar pain, different in nature, perhaps, but similar in depth. On the 10th day, as Caleb repaired a section of fence in the northern pasture, Sarah approached on horseback. She dismounted and handed him a canteen of water without comment. He accepted it with a nod, careful to avoid touching her fingers during the exchange. "You do good work," she said, watching as he secured a post. "Better than most." "Thank you, ma'am. The others were wondering if you'd join us for supper tonight. Inside the house, I mean. We usually eat together on Sundays." Caleb paused, his discomfort evident. "I appreciate the offer, but—" "It's not just an offer," Sarah interrupted. "It's part of how things work here. We're not just 6 women and a hired hand. We're all that stands between survival and starvation. Breaking bread together matters." Caleb met her gaze, seeing the determination there. "Yes, ma'am. I'll be there." That evening, Caleb approached the main house with the reluctance of a man walking to the gallows. He had washed as best he could, put on his cleanest shirt, and even trimmed his beard slightly. Still, he felt out of place as he knocked on the door. Emma opened it, her smile genuine. "Mr. Harding, please come in." The interior of the Carson home was modest but comfortable. The main room served as both kitchen and dining area, with a large table dominating the space. A stone fireplace provided warmth and light, supplemented by several oil lamps. The furnishings were simple but well-maintained, a testament to the care with which these women approached their lives. All 6 women were already seated at the table. Sarah indicated an empty chair, and Caleb took his place, acutely aware of his proximity to others. The meal was simple but abundant: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and vegetables from Emma's garden. A moment of silence followed as Sarah offered a brief prayer, then the food began to be passed around. "Mr. Harding," Mary said, offering him the platter of beef, "we've been wondering where you learned to handle horses so well." Caleb accepted the platter, careful to avoid contact with her hands. "My father raised horses in Missouri. Learned from him." "Missouri?" Rebecca asked. "That's a long way from here." "Yes, it is." A moment of awkward silence followed before Abigail spoke. "You fought in the war?" Caleb's jaw tightened visibly. "Yes." "Which side?" Josephine asked, her voice quiet but direct. "Union." The tension eased slightly, though Caleb's discomfort remained evident. Emma, sensing his unease, changed the subject. "We're hoping to drive some cattle to market next month," she said. "The price is good in Cheyenne right now." "That's a difficult drive," Caleb observed. "Rough country between here and there." "Which is why we need your help," Sarah explained. "None of us can be spared from the ranch for that long. We need someone to handle the drive." Caleb considered this. "How many head?" 30. "It's not much, but it's enough to see us through winter if we get a fair price." The conversation continued, focusing on practical matters: the cattle drive, repairs needed before winter, supplies that needed restocking. Gradually, Caleb's rigid posture relaxed slightly, though he remained vigilant about maintaining physical distance. As the meal concluded and Emma served apple pie, Abigail asked the question that had been on all their minds. "Mr. Harding, if you don't mind my asking, why do you always wear those gloves?" The table fell silent. Caleb's expression closed like a door slammed shut in a storm. "I mind," he said simply. Sarah gave Abigail a warning look, and the subject was dropped. The remainder of the evening passed in strained conversation, and Caleb excused himself as soon as politeness allowed. Later that night, as Caleb sat alone in his room, a knock came at his door. He opened it to find Sarah standing there, a small tin of salve in her hand. "I noticed you favoring your right hand today," she said. "This might help." Caleb hesitated before accepting the tin. "Thank you." Sarah didn't leave immediately. "The war left marks on all of us, Mr. Harding. Some just show more than others." Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, leaving him with the tin and the uncomfortable knowledge that she had seen through his carefully constructed barriers. The following weeks established a rhythm to life at the Carson Ranch. Caleb worked from dawn until dusk, gradually transforming the neglected property. Fences were mended, the barn roof repaired, and the cattle began to show the benefits of proper care. He kept his distance from the women, but their daily proximity slowly eroded the edges of his isolation. Emma left freshly baked bread outside his door. Mary sought his advice on a difficult horse. Rebecca asked for help with a mathematical problem related to their finances. Each interaction was brief, respectful of his boundaries, but persistent in their gentle invasion of his solitude. Only Josephine maintained a distance equal to his own. She watched him with knowing eyes, recognizing in him a familiar pain. One evening, as Caleb repaired his saddle outside the stable, she approached. "Your scars," she said without preamble. "They're from shackles, aren't they?" Caleb's hand stilled. He looked up at her, seeing not pity but understanding. "Yes." She nodded once. "I have them too. Not on my wrists, but here." She touched her back briefly. "Some wounds never fully heal." "No," Caleb agreed. "They don't. But they change," Josephine said. "Over time, they become something different. Not just a reminder of pain, but of survival." With that, she walked away, leaving Caleb to contemplate her words as the setting sun cast long shadows across the ranch. The preparations for the cattle drive consumed their days. Caleb selected the 30 head carefully, choosing those most likely to bring a good price at market. Sarah insisted on accompanying him, despite his objections. "It's my cattle and my money," she said firmly. "I'm coming." "It's dangerous," Caleb argued. "Rustleur, storm, roux terrain." All the more reason to have two people instead of one. Her expression brooked no argument. "We leave in 3 days." The night before their departure, Caleb found himself unable to sleep. The prospect of traveling alone with Sarah for nearly 2 weeks filled him with unease. Not because he feared her, but because he feared himself, his growing inability to maintain the emotional distance that had protected him for so long. As dawn broke, Caleb and Sarah prepared to depart. The other women gathered to see them off, each offering practical assistance and words of encouragement. Emma provided food for the journey. Mary had prepared the horses with exceptional care. Rebecca had organized their supplies with meticulous attention to detail. Abigail gave advice about the cattle, and Josephine handed Sarah a small pistol to conceal in her boot. For emergencies, she said simply. As they rode away, the 5 women stood together, watching until Caleb, Sarah, and the small herd disappeared over the ridge. None of them could have predicted the events that would unfold during that journey, or how profoundly changed both Caleb and Sarah would be upon their return. The cattle drive began under clear skies, with the autumn sun casting a golden hue over the rolling Wyoming landscape. Caleb took the lead, setting a steady pace that would conserve the cattle's strength while making consistent progress toward Cheyenne. Sarah rode at the rear, her rifle across her saddle, eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for potential threats. They spoke little during those first days, communicating primarily through gestures and brief phrases related to the drive. At night, they established separate camps on either side of the bedded-down cattle, close enough for safety, but distant enough to maintain the boundaries Caleb so rigidly enforced. On the 4th night, as they made camp near a small creek, a change in weather brought them closer than either had anticipated. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, carrying the promise of a powerful storm. Caleb worked quickly to create a makeshift shelter using a canvas tarp stretched between several stunted trees. "Storm's coming in fast," he said, securing the last corner of the tarp. "We should be able to keep the cattle contained in that small valley, but we'll need to stay dry if we can." Sarah nodded, eyeing the narrow shelter with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "Will it hold?" "It should. We'll be cramped, but it's better than being soaked through." The first heavy drops began to fall as they gathered their essential supplies and led their horses into the limited protection of a dense stand of trees. By the time they ducked under the tarp, the rain was falling in sheets, driven horizontally by gusting winds that howled through the nearby ravine. Caleb pressed himself against the far edge of the shelter, creating as much distance as possible in the confined space. Sarah pretended not to notice, busying herself with arranging their saddlebags to serve as makeshift pillows. Might as well try to get some rest, she suggested, raising her voice slightly to be heard over the storm. I doubt we'll be moving those cattle until this passes. Caleb nodded, his posture rigid as he settled against his saddle. The proximity was unsettling, awakening memories he had long suppressed. The sound of rain on canvas transported him back to another time, another storm, when shelter had meant something very different. As if sensing his discomfort, Sarah spoke. My husband, James, and I came out here from Pennsylvania 7 years ago. Everyone said we were fools, a schoolteacher and a bookkeeper trying to run a cattle ranch. The unexpected conversation drew Caleb reluctantly from his memories. What made you do it? Sarah smiled slightly. James had consumption. The doctor said he needed dry air and open spaces. We sold everything, bought the land site unseen, and headed west with more hope than sense. Seems to have worked out, Caleb observed. For a time, Sarah agreed, her smile fading. James got better, much better. We built the house, established the herd. For 5 years, we lived a good life. Then the fever came through last winter. Caleb remained silent, recognizing the grief that underscored her words. Within a week, I lost my husband, and nearly half the people in Pine Creek lost someone, Sarah continued. Emma and I would have lost the ranch if the others hadn't come. 6 widows with nothing but determination and a willingness to defy convention. It's impressive, Caleb acknowledged. What you've built together. Sarah studied him in the dim light filtering through the canvas. We all have our stories, Mr. Harding. Some are just harder to tell than others. The invitation to share his own story hung in the air between them. Caleb turned away, focusing on the sound of rain. You should get some sleep, Mrs. Carson. I'll check on the cattle once the storm eases. Sarah accepted his deflection without comment, wrapping herself in a blanket and settling against her saddlebag. Soon, her breathing deepened into the rhythm of sleep, leaving Caleb alone with his thoughts and memories. The storm continued through the night, gradually diminishing to a steady drizzle by dawn. They emerged from their shelter to find the landscape transformed. Streams had swollen, low areas flooded, and the trail ahead would be muddy and treacherous. The cattle, however, had weathered the storm well, huddled together in the protected valley. We'll lose a day, maybe 2, waiting for the ground to firm up, Caleb assessed, surveying the sodden terrain. Sarah nodded her agreement. Better that than risk losing cattle in the mud. They established a more substantial camp, resigned to the delay. Caleb constructed a better shelter and built a small fire to dry their damp clothing and provide warmth against the chill that followed the storm. Despite his usual reticence, the enforced proximity gradually led to conversation. Sarah spoke of her life before Wyoming, her childhood in Philadelphia, her brief career as a teacher, her courtship with James. Caleb listened more than he spoke, offering occasional comments or questions that revealed his own education and intelligence. It was the most sustained interaction he had engaged in for years, and despite his discomfort, he found himself responding to Sarah's straightforward manner and lack of prying questions. On the second evening of their delay, as they sat by the fire after a simple meal, Sarah asked, "Where will you go after the cattle drive?" The question caught Caleb off guard. "Back to the ranch, I suppose. Unless you're planning to let me go." "No," Sarah assured him quickly. "Your work is excellent. I just wondered if you had other plans." Most drifters don't stay in one place long. Caleb stared into the fire. "I haven't thought much beyond the next day for a long time." "And before that, before you started drifting?" The question brushed against boundaries Caleb had maintained for years. Yet something about this woman, her direct gaze, her matter-of-fact acceptance of life's hardships, made deception seem pointless. "I was a teacher," he said finally, "in St. Louis." Sarah's surprise was evident. A teacher, Latin and literature. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Not much call for that out here. What happened?" The question was gentle but direct. Caleb's expression closed. "The war." Sarah nodded, understanding that the simple phrase contained complexities he wasn't ready to share. "Well, Mr. Harding, if you ever feel inclined to teach again, Pine Creek has no school. The children are taught by parents when they can spare the time, which isn't often. The suggestion hung in the air, neither accepted nor rejected, as they prepared for sleep. The following morning brought clearing skies and firmer ground. They resumed the drive, making good progress through increasingly rugged terrain. Caleb's vigilance increased as they entered a region known for its lawlessness, with small bands of rustlers preying on isolated cattle drives. His concerns proved justified on the 8th day when they spotted 3 riders observing them from a distant ridge. "Trouble?" Sarah asked, noticing the direction of his gaze. "Possibly," Caleb replied. "Keep the herd moving. I'll ride ahead and find a defensible position for tonight." By evening, they had reached a natural enclosure formed by steep rock walls on 3 sides, with a narrow entrance that could be easily guarded. They drove the cattle into this natural corral and prepared for a potential confrontation. "They might just be passing through," Sarah suggested, though her actions, checking her rifle, positioning herself with a clear view of the approach, indicated she didn't believe it. "Maybe," Caleb conceded, "but it's better to be prepared." As darkness fell, they maintained their vigilance, taking turns to rest while the other kept watch. It was during Sarah's watch, shortly after midnight, that the attack came. 3 men approached silently on foot, having left their horses some distance away. Their intent was clear: to overwhelm the drovers quickly, take the cattle, and disappear into the night. They didn't account for Sarah's alertness or her skill with a rifle. Her warning shot sent them scrambling for cover, and the ensuing gunfight was brief but intense. Caleb, awakened by the first shot, joined the defense with grim efficiency that spoke of experience beyond that of a schoolteacher. One of the rustlers fell to Sarah's accurate fire. Another was wounded by Caleb. The third fled into the darkness. In the sudden silence that followed, Caleb approached the fallen man cautiously, his gun ready. The rustler was dead, shot through the heart. The wounded man cursed and clutched his bleeding leg. "You killed Pete," he snarled at Sarah. "He was trying to steal our cattle and likely would have killed us," she replied, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. "What did you expect?" Caleb bound the man's wound tightly, then secured him with rope from their supplies. "We'll take him to the sheriff in the next settlement," he decided. "It's only half a day's ride." The remainder of the night passed without further incident, though neither Caleb nor Sarah slept. As dawn broke, they prepared to move on, securing their prisoner on his own horse with his hands bound to the saddle horn. "You've done this before," Sarah observed as she watched Caleb's methodical preparations. "Yes." During the war, Caleb's jaw tightened, and after, something in his tone discouraged further questions. They resumed their journey, now burdened with a sullen prisoner and the knowledge that his companion might return with reinforcements. The small settlement of Eagle Rock consisted of little more than a general store, a saloon, and a sheriff's office. They delivered their prisoner to the local lawman, a grizzled veteran named Wilson, who recognized the wounded man. "Jake Mercer," the sheriff said with disgust. "Been looking for you and your friends for months. Where's the rest of your gang?" "One's dead," Sarah informed him. "The other got away." Sheriff Wilson took their statements and assured them that Mercer would face justice for rustling and attempted murder. "You two handled yourselves well," he commented. Not many could have fought off the Mercer gang. They resupplied at the general store and continued their journey, both sobered by the violence and aware that the remaining rustler could still pose a threat. The incident had revealed aspects of each other they hadn't previously seen: Sarah's steadiness under fire, Caleb's combat experience, creating a new layer of understanding between them. That evening, as they made camp in a protected hollow, Sarah found herself studying Caleb with new eyes. "You weren't just a soldier," she said finally. "During the war, you were something more." Caleb met her gaze directly for the first time. "I was a captain in the Union Army. Infantry. And after the war, before you became a drifter?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications. Caleb's expression hardened, then gradually softened as he made a decision. "After the war, I was a U.S. Marshal in the Missouri Territory," he said quietly. "For 3 years." Sarah absorbed this information. "What happened?" Caleb removed his gloves slowly, revealing the scarred wrists that he kept so carefully hidden. I was ambushed by a gang I'd been tracking. They held me for 5 days before my partner found me. The simplicity of the statement belied the horror it contained. Sarah's eyes widened as understanding dawned. They tortured you. Yes. The word emerged as barely more than a whisper. They used rope, mostly. Tied, so tight it cut to the bone. Among other things. Sarah's hand moved instinctively toward his, stopping just short of contact when she saw him flinch. "I am sorry." Caleb replaced his gloves with deliberate movements. "It was a long time ago, but it's why you don't." She gestured vaguely, indicating his aversion to touch. "Yes." He stared into the fire. The brain makes strange connections. Pain and touch became linked. Even now, years later, being touched feels like burning. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Sarah recognized the immense trust he had placed in her by sharing this part of himself. "Thank you," she said simply, "for telling me." Caleb nodded once, then turned the conversation to practical matters: their route for the next day, the condition of the cattle, the likelihood of reaching Cheyenne within their planned time frame. But something had shifted between them, a barrier lowered, allowing a fragile connection to form. The remainder of the journey passed without further incident. They reached Cheyenne 4 days later, driving their cattle into the stockyards under a clear autumn sky. The cattle buyer was impressed with the quality of their herd and offered a fair price, which Sarah negotiated upward with surprising skill. As they counted their earnings in a private room at the Cheyenne Hotel, Sarah's satisfaction was evident. "This will see us through winter with some to spare," she said, carefully dividing the money into several small pouches for safer transport. "You drive a hard bargain," Caleb observed with a hint of admiration. "James taught me never to accept the first offer," she replied, a fleeting sadness crossing her features at the mention of her husband. "We should celebrate. Have a proper meal before heading back tomorrow." The hotel's dining room offered the first real comfort they had experienced in nearly 2 weeks. Clean linen tablecloths, polished silverware, and well-prepared food created a stark contrast to their trail meals. Sarah had purchased a new dress for the occasion, a simple blue garment that nonetheless transformed her from trail-worn rancher to elegant woman. Caleb, too, had made an effort, visiting the barber for a trim and purchasing a new shirt. As they sat across from each other, sharing a meal that neither had to prepare over a campfire, the context of civilization seemed to heighten their awareness of each other as individuals rather than merely travel companions. "To a successful drive," Sarah proposed, raising her glass. "And safe return," Caleb added, touching his glass to hers. As they ate, they discussed plans for the ranch, improvements to be made, strategies for increasing their herd, possibilities for diversification. Caleb found himself offering suggestions and observations that revealed his growing investment in the ranch's success. "You've thought about this a great deal," Sarah noted. "It's a good operation," Caleb replied, "with potential. And will you stay to see that potential realized?" The question was casual, but her eyes revealed its importance. Caleb considered his response carefully. "I'd like to, if I'm welcome." "You are," Sarah assured him. "Very much so." The return journey began the following morning, with both riders acutely aware of the changes that had occurred during their time together. The distance Caleb maintained was no longer absolute. He rode closer, spoke more freely, and occasionally even smiled. Sarah respected his physical boundaries, but gradually breached his emotional defenses with her direct questions and honest answers. 3 days from the ranch, they encountered a severe early snowstorm that forced them to seek shelter in an abandoned line shack. The small, one-room structure offered protection from the howling wind and driving snow, but little comfort beyond a rusty stove and dilapidated cot. Caleb worked quickly to secure the horses in the attached lean-to and gather enough firewood to last through the night. Sarah cleared decades of dust from the interior and repaired a broken window with canvas from their supplies. By nightfall, they had created a reasonably comfortable shelter against the storm that raged outside. The confined space eliminated any possibility of maintaining physical distance. They sat side by side near the stove, sharing a meal of beans and jerky as wind rattled the thin walls of the shack. Reminds me of our first storm on the trail, Sarah observed. Though at least we have a proper roof this time. Caleb nodded. Should blow over by morning. These early storms usually don't last. They prepared for sleep, with Sarah taking the cot, while Caleb arranged his bedroll on the floor nearby. As the fire in the stove died down to embers, the temperature in the shack dropped rapidly. Sarah's voice came through the darkness. This is foolish. We'll both freeze like this. I'll be fine, Caleb insisted, though his shivering belied his words. No, you won't, Sarah countered. And neither will I. We need to share warmth. The suggestion sent a jolt of panic through Caleb. I can't. I know, Sarah interrupted gently. I understand why. But I'm not asking you to touch me. Just to lie back to back. For warmth only. The rational part of Caleb's mind recognized the sense in her suggestion. The emotional part rebelled violently against the prospect of such proximity. But as the cold intensified and his shivering became uncontrollable, survival instinct gradually overcame fear. With extreme reluctance, he moved his bedroll alongside the narrow cot and lay down, his back towards Sarah. She carefully positioned herself so that only their backs touched, a thin layer of blankets between them. Is this acceptable? She asked quietly. Caleb's entire body had gone rigid at the contact, but as the minutes passed and the shared warmth began to seep through the blankets, his muscles gradually relaxed. Yes, he answered finally. It's acceptable. They lay in silence, each acutely aware of the other's presence, but respecting the fragile nature of this compromise. Eventually, exhaustion overcame discomfort, and Caleb drifted into an uneasy sleep. The first time in years he had slept in such proximity to another person. He woke sometime in the night, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar sensation of warmth against his back. For a brief, peaceful moment, he existed without the constant vigilance that had defined his life for so long. Then memory returned, bringing with it the familiar tension. Yet it was different now, less acute, more manageable. Sarah's steady breathing indicated she was still asleep. Caleb remained perfectly still, analyzing this new development with cautious hope. Perhaps, he thought, healing was possible after all. Morning brought clear skies and a world transformed by snow, pristine white covering the landscape as far as the eye could see. They prepared to depart in companionable silence, neither mentioning the night's arrangement, but both changed by it in subtle ways. The final days of their journey passed quickly, the trail home familiar and direct. As they crested the last ridge before the Carson Ranch, they paused to take in the view. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main house, and figures moved about the yard, preparing for the evening chores. Home, Sarah said simply. Caleb nodded, surprised to find that the word resonated within him. It had been many years since any place had felt like home. The return of Sarah and Caleb was met with relief and celebration. The 5 women gathered in the yard as the riders approached, their faces lighting with joy at the sight of their friend and employer returning safely. Emma rushed forward, embracing her sister warmly. We were starting to worry. The snow reached us 3 days ago. We got caught in it too, Sarah explained, dismounting. Had to wait it out in an old line shack. The others surrounded them, asking questions about the journey and the cattle sale. Caleb stood slightly apart, observing the reunion with a mixture of awkwardness and something akin to belonging. Mary approached him, leading his horse toward the stable. Welcome back, Mr. Harding. Ranch wasn't the same without you. Her casual comment caught him off guard. Thank you, he managed, uncertain how to respond to the implied acceptance. That evening, they gathered in the main house for a proper meal. A feast by their standards with fresh bread, roast venison, preserved vegetables, and an apple pie. The atmosphere was warm and festive as Sarah recounted their journey, including the confrontation with the rustlers. Mr. Harding saved our lives and the cattle, she concluded. He's quite the marksman. The women's eyes turned to Caleb with new appreciation. He shifted uncomfortably under their scrutiny. Mrs. Carson exaggerates, he said. She's the one who shot True. Well, between the two of you, you brought home enough money to see us through winter with some to spare, Emma declared, raising her cup in a toast. to successful ventures and safe returns. As the evening progressed, Caleb found himself drawn into conversations despite his usual reticence. Rebecca sought his opinion on a book she was reading. Abigail asked about the cattle they had sold. Mary discussed the training of a particularly difficult colt. Even Josephine, typically as reserved as Caleb himself, engaged him in a brief discussion about the changing weather patterns. It was the most extended social interaction he had experienced in years, and though it left him exhausted, he found it strangely satisfying. The following weeks established a new rhythm to life at the Carson Ranch. Winter settled over the land, bringing shorter days and longer nights. The pace of work changed, focused now on maintenance and survival rather than expansion and improvement. Livestock needed constant attention in the cold. Buildings required reinforcement against snow and wind, and the daily challenges of frontier life intensified with each dropping degree. Caleb continued to maintain physical distance from the women, but his emotional barriers gradually eroded. He joined them for meals more frequently, contributed to conversations, and occasionally even displayed a dry wit that surprised them all. He remained guarded about his past, but small details emerged through casual comments: his education, his brief teaching career, his service during the war. The women, in turn, revealed more of themselves. Emma spoke of her thwarted ambition to become a writer. Mary shared stories of her childhood, straddling two cultures. Rebecca confessed her fear that she would never overcome her grief. Abigail revealed her desire to establish a small school on the ranch for the children of neighboring homesteads. Josephine rarely spoke of her past, but demonstrated a profound knowledge of herbal medicine that proved invaluable during the harsh winter months. Sarah observed these developments with quiet satisfaction. The ranch was becoming what she and James had always envisioned, not just a business, but a community. The presence of Caleb, initially so foreign and unsettling, now seemed an integral part of their unusual family. December brought the season's first severe blizzard, confining them all to the main house for 3 days. The enforced proximity might once have been unbearable for Caleb, but he found himself adapting, discovering strategies to maintain his essential boundaries while participating in the shared experience. He repaired tools in one corner of the main room, while the women engaged in various indoor tasks: mending, cooking, reading, playing cards. On the third evening of their confinement, as a howling wind rattled the windows, Emma retrieved her fiddle from its case. "Music seems in order," she declared, tuning the instrument with practiced hands. The simple melodies she played transformed the atmosphere, bringing warmth that exceeded that of the blazing fireplace. Rebecca began to sing in a clear, sweet voice, and soon the others joined in, even Abigail, who claimed to have no musical ability whatsoever. Caleb remained silent, but his foot tapped in rhythm with the lively tunes. When Emma played a melancholy ballad about a soldier returning from war, his expression grew distant, lost in memories that the music evoked. "Do you play, Mr. Harding?" Emma asked during a pause between songs. "I did once," he admitted. "Piano, mainly, and a little violin. Would you like to try?" She offered the fiddle hesitantly, aware of his aversion to touch. Caleb stared at the instrument, conflict evident in his features. Then, with deliberate movements, he removed his gloves and accepted the fiddle, careful to avoid contact with Emma's hands during the exchange. A hush fell over the room as he positioned the instrument under his chin. For a moment, he remained motionless, as if remembering how to connect with this aspect of his former self. Then he drew the bow across the strings, producing a tentative note that gradually strengthened into a melody, simple at first, then increasingly complex as his confidence grew. The women watched in silent amazement as Caleb played, his scarred hands moving with unexpected grace. The music he created was haunting and beautiful, filled with emotions he rarely displayed. When the final note faded into silence, he lowered the fiddle, suddenly self-conscious in the face of their rapt attention. "That was beautiful," Sarah said softly. "What was it?" "Bach," Caleb replied, returning the instrument to Emma with the same careful avoidance of contact. "Something my mother taught me." He replaced his gloves quickly, but the brief exposure of his vulnerability lingered in the room, creating a new understanding between him and the women who had welcomed him into their lives. The blizzard passed, and life resumed its winter routine. Christmas approached, bringing with it preparations that transformed the ranch house. Evergreen boughs adorned mantels and doorways. Candles appeared in windows. Small, thoughtful gifts were crafted in secret. Caleb observed these activities with a mixture of nostalgia and detachment. He had not celebrated Christmas properly since before the war, and the traditions seemed to belong to another life, one he had lost access to long ago. On Christmas Eve, he retreated to the bunkhouse early, avoiding the festivities in the main house. He sat alone in his small room, a single lantern providing meager light as he cleaned his revolver, a practical task to occupy his hands and mind. A knock at the door interrupted his solitude. He opened it to find Sarah standing there, holding a covered plate. "You missed supper," she said, and the gift exchange. "I didn't think my presence was necessary," Caleb replied, accepting the plate with a nod of thanks. "Not necessary, perhaps, but desired." Sarah handed him a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "From all of us." Caleb stared at the gift, momentarily at a loss. "I didn't get anything for any of you." "Your presence here has been gift enough," Sarah assured him. "The ranch wouldn't have survived without your help these past months." She left him to his privacy, but her brief visit disrupted the careful isolation he had constructed. Caleb set aside his half-cleaned revolver and unwrapped the package with unusual care. Inside was a pair of gloves, finer than any he had owned, made of soft leather that would allow for dexterity while providing the barrier he required. A small note accompanied them, "For hands that build rather than destroy. With gratitude, the women of Carson Ranch." Caleb ran his fingers over the gloves, throat tight with unexpected emotion. The thoughtfulness of the gift, acknowledging his need while honoring his contribution, touched something he had thought long dead within him. Christmas Day dawned clear and cold. Caleb, after much internal debate, made his way to the main house, wearing his new gloves and carrying 6 crudely wrapped packages, small wooden carvings he had created during the long winter evenings. A deer for Emma, who loved nature's grace. A horse for Mary, who understood their spirit. A book for Rebecca, who found solace in stories. A star for Abigail, who gazed at the night sky and dreamed of possibilities. A bird in flight for Josephine, whose resilience he admired. And for Sarah, a small house with smoke curling from its chimney, a symbol of the home she had created against all odds. His awkward offerings were received with genuine appreciation, the simple gifts valued for the effort and thought they represented. The day passed in shared meals, quiet conversations, and moments of connection that gradually eased Caleb's deep-seated isolation. January brought renewed challenges. Temperatures that froze breath in the air, livestock that required constant attention to prevent freezing, and the ever-present threat of illness in such harsh conditions. When Rebecca developed a severe cough that progressed to pneumonia, the precarious nature of their existence became starkly apparent. For 3 days and nights, they took turns sitting with her, applying Josephine's herbal remedies, keeping her warm, and praying for improvement. On the 4th night, as her condition worsened, Kayla volunteered to ride to Pine Creek for the doctor, a dangerous journey through snow-covered terrain in the darkness. "It's too risky," Sarah protested. "Wait until morning." "She may not have until morning," Caleb replied, already preparing for the ride. "I've made similar journeys before." He departed before further objections could be raised, pushing his horse through deep snow and navigating by starlight. The journey that normally took 3 hours stretched to 5, but he reached Pine Creek as dawn broke and returned with the doctor by mid-morning. Dr. Wilson, an aging man with a perpetual scowl and remarkable skill, managed to stabilize Rebecca's condition. "She'll recover," he announced after several tense hours. But it was a near thing. Another day without treatment. He left the conclusion unspoken. The doctor stayed overnight, monitoring his patient and sharing news from town. As he prepared to depart the following morning, he drew Caleb aside. That was a fool's errand you undertook, he said bluntly. Could have killed yourself in that cold. Caleb merely shrugged. Seemed necessary. The doctor studied him with professional interest. You're not what I expected when Sarah mentioned a drifter working the ranch. Most would have hunkered down and hoped for the best. I'm not most, Caleb replied simply. No, the doctor agreed. You're not. He mounted his horse and tipped his hat. So you come spring, if not before. Try to keep these women alive until then. They're too stubborn to die easily, but winter's not done with us yet. February brought another blizzard, worse than the first. 4 or 5 days, they were completely isolated, the ranch buildings barely visible to each other through the swirling snow. They consolidated in the main house, bringing essential supplies and abandoning the outlying structures to the storm. Caleb took the small back room, maintaining his privacy while remaining accessible. He focused on practical matters, keeping the fire burning, ensuring structural integrity, venturing out in brief expeditions to check on the livestock in the barn. The women managed the interior concerns, food, water, care for Rebecca, still recovering, and maintaining a semblance of normalcy in the face of nature's fury. On the third night, as wind screamed around the eaves like a living thing, Emma's composure finally broke. She had been the pillar of cheerfulness throughout their confinement, organizing games, reading aloud, and maintaining optimism. But the relentless storm, combined with worry for her sister and the underlying strain of their precarious existence, proved too much. What if it never stops? She asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. What if we're just buried here? Forgotten? The others exchanged concerned glances. Emma's fears, though dramatically expressed, reflected anxieties they all harbored to some degree. Storms always pass, Abigail offered practically. Been through worse in 68. But what if, Emma began again, only to be interrupted by an unexpected source. Virgil, Caleb said from his position near the fire. The Aeneid, Book 1. All eyes turned to him in confusion. O socii, nec enim ignari summis ante malorum. O passi gravura, dabit deus is quoque finum, he recited, the Latin flowing with surprising ease from his lips. Then, seeing their bewilderment, he translated, O my friends, we have not been unacquainted with hardships before this. You have endured worse. God will grant an end to these troubles as well. The room fell silent except for the howling wind. Then Rebecca, weak but improving, spoke from her place on the small cot near the fire. You really were a teacher, weren't you? Caleb nodded, somewhat embarrassed by his unexpected display of education. Latin and literature, at a boys' academy in St. Louis. Would you teach us? Emma asked suddenly. While we're trapped here, just something to focus on besides the storm. The request caught Caleb off guard. Teach you Latin? Anything, Emma clarified. Stories, history, whatever you know. Just help us forget the storm for a while. Caleb looked around at the women. Emma with her desperate hope, Rebecca with scholarly interest despite her illness, Abigail with practical curiosity, Mary with quiet anticipation, Josephine with knowing patience, and Sarah with gentle encouragement. Something within him responded to their need, overriding his habitual reticence. I could tell you about ancient Rome, he offered hesitantly, or Greek mythology. Shakespeare, perhaps. All of it, Emma decided. We have time. And so, as the blizzard raged outside, Caleb found himself teaching again for the first time in over a decade. He began with the Trojan War, recounting the epic tale with surprising animation. He described the gods and heroes, the tragic fall of Troy, the wanderings of Odysseus, and the founding of Rome by Aeneas. The women listened with rapt attention, asking questions, offering observations, and gradually drawing him deeper into the role he had abandoned. Over the following days, as the storm continued, his impromptu lessons expanded to include Roman history, Shakespearean tragedies, and even rudimentary Latin phrases. By the time the blizzard finally subsided, leaving them to dig out from massive snowdrifts, something fundamental had changed in Caleb's relationship with the women of Carson Ranch. He had shared a part of himself long buried, revealing the educated man behind the scar drifter. March brought the first hints of spring, slightly longer days, occasional thaws, and the promise of renewal. The harsh winter had depleted their resources but strengthened their bonds. They had survived through mutual support and shared determination, emerging with a deeper appreciation for each other's strengths and a greater tolerance for each other's weaknesses. For Caleb, the changes were both subtle and profound. He still wore gloves at all times, still maintained physical distance, still struggled with memories that haunted his dreams. But he no longer isolated himself completely. He joined meals without hesitation, contributed to conversations willingly, and gradually allowed himself to be known beyond the surface. The informal lessons continued one evening each week, evolving into a shared exploration of ideas rather than formal instruction. Emma borrowed books from Pine Creek's small library, expanding their discussions beyond Caleb's memory. Rebecca, fully recovered, revealed a keen, analytical mind that challenged his perspectives. Abigail brought practical applications to theoretical concepts. Mary contributed insights from her dual cultural heritage. Josephine occasionally shared wisdom from traditions unknown to the others. And Sarah observed it all with quiet satisfaction, watching as her unusual family found new ways to connect and grow. April brought mud season, the challenging transition between winter's grip and spring's renewal. The snow melted, turning roads to quagmires and fields to swamps. New challenges emerged as they prepared for planting, repaired winter damage, and tended to the livestock adjusting to changing conditions. It was during this time of renewal that tragedy struck without warning. A late spring storm, not unusual for Wyoming, brought heavy rain rather than snow. The creek that bordered the eastern edge of the property, swollen with snowmelt and rainfall, rose rapidly during the night. By dawn, it had breached its banks and threatened the lower pasture where several pregnant cows were sheltered. Caleb and Abigail rode out at first light to move the cattle to higher ground. The work was difficult but proceeding well until one cow, heavy with calf and frightened by the rising water, bolted toward the creek. Abigail, closest to the panicked animal, rode after it without hesitation. What happened next occurred with terrible swiftness. The bank, undermined by the flood, collapsed beneath the weight of horse and rider. Abigail and her mount plunged into the churning water and were swept downstream immediately. Caleb reacted instinctively, spurring his horse along the creek bank, keeping pace with the struggling figures in the water. Abigail managed to free herself from her horse, but was clearly fighting a losing battle against the current. When she disappeared beneath the surface, Caleb made a decision that contradicted every instinct he had developed since his trauma. He dismounted, stripped off his coat, and plunged into the frigid water. The shock of immersion nearly paralyzed him, not just from the cold, but from the overwhelming sensory contact of water against his skin. For a moment, panic threatened to overcome him. Then training and determination asserted themselves. He struck out toward the spot where Abigail had disappeared, diving beneath the surface to search the murky depths. His hands, still gloved despite the circumstances, found fabric than an arm. He pulled upward with all his strength, bringing Abigail's limp form to the surface. The current carried them downstream as he struggled to keep both their heads above water while fighting toward the shore. They emerged nearly a quarter mile from where they had entered, Caleb dragging Abigail's unconscious form onto the muddy bank. She wasn't breathing. With no time to consider the implications, he removed his gloves and began the necessary procedures to revive her, clearing her airway, compressing her chest, forcing air into her lungs. Long moments passed with no response. Caleb continued his efforts, refusing to acknowledge defeat. Finally, Abigail convulsed, expelling water and drawing a ragged breath. Caleb turned her on her side, supporting her as she coughed and gasped her way back to life. "Stay still," he instructed, retrieving his gloves and pulling them on with shaking hands. "Help will come soon." Indeed, Sarah and Mary were already riding toward them, having witnessed the disaster from a distance. Within minutes, They had wrapped Abigail in blankets and prepared to transport her back to the ranch house. "You're freezing too," Sarah observed, noting Caleb's soaked clothing and blue-tinged lips. "I'll manage," he insisted, though he was shivering violently. The return to the ranch was slow and careful. Emma and Rebecca had prepared for their arrival, heating water for baths and gathering every available blanket. Josephine had medicinal teas brewing to combat the effects of cold and immersion. Abigail was tended to first, bathed, dressed in warm clothing, and settled near the fire with hot bricks at her feet and multiple blankets covering her. She remained weak but alert, her eyes following Caleb as he refused similar treatment, accepting only dry clothing and a position near the fire. "You saved my life," she said simply when they were finally alone, the others having dispersed to prepare a hot meal. Caleb shrugged uncomfortably. Anyone would have done the same. "No, Abigail contradicted. Not everyone would risk themselves that way, especially not someone who—" She hesitated, then continued gently. "Someone who finds touch so difficult." Caleb stared into the fire, unable to meet her gaze. "It was necessary." "Yes," she agreed, "but that doesn't make it any less remarkable." She paused, then added quietly, "Thank you, Caleb." It was the first time any of them had used his given name rather than the formal Mr. Harding. The simple act of familiarity affected him more deeply than he could have anticipated. That evening, as they gathered for a meal that celebrated survival rather than mourned loss, Caleb found himself surrounded by a different kind of flood, one of gratitude, respect, and something akin to love. These women, who had accepted him with all his peculiarities and pain, now looked at him with a new awareness of the man beneath the scars. The following day, when Caleb joined them for breakfast, he came without his gloves for the first time. His scarred hands drew no comments, no stares, only a quiet acknowledgement of the trust the gesture represented. When he reached for bread, his fingers briefly brushed against Emma's. He flinched but did not retreat, the momentary contact uncomfortable but no longer unbearable. It was a small step, almost insignificant to an outside observer. But to Caleb, and to the women who had become his unlikely family, it represented something profound, the beginning of healing, the possibility of a future not defined by past trauma. Spring advanced into early summer. The ranch flourished under their combined efforts, fields planted, cattle thriving, buildings repaired, and plans made for expansion. Caleb's lessons evolved into a formal arrangement with the neighboring homesteads, with children gathering at the ranch 3 afternoons each week for instruction. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. Caleb still struggled with touch, still wore his gloves most of the time, still woke from nightmares that left him shaking and disoriented. But he was no longer defined solely by his trauma. He was a teacher again, a respected member of their unusual community, a man slowly reclaiming pieces of himself long thought lost. In late June, as they celebrated the successful birth of a dozen healthy calves, Sarah found Caleb sitting alone on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, settling into the chair beside him. Caleb considered the question before answering. "I was thinking about time, how it changes things. People." Sarah nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind his simple statement. "For better, I hope." "Yes," he agreed. "For better." They sat in companionable silence as darkness gradually claimed the land. Then, with deliberate care, Caleb removed his right glove and placed his bare hand on the arm of his chair, palm up, an invitation, not a demand. Sarah looked at the offered hand, understanding all it represented. Slowly, giving him every opportunity to withdraw, she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, trembling slightly but not retreating. They remained that way as stars appeared in the night sky. Two damaged people finding healing in each other's presence. No words were needed to express what they both understood. That some journeys can only be completed with companions. That some wounds can only heal through connection. And that even the deepest scars can become markers of survival rather than reminders of pain. Inside the house, Emma played her fiddle, the sweet melody drifting through the open window. Mary's laugh rang out at something Rebecca said. Abigail's practical voice offered a counterpoint to Josephine's quiet wisdom. The sounds of the home they had built together surrounded Caleb and Sarah as they sat hand in hand, facing the future with hard-won hope.